Back in 2020, when the world felt like it was coming apart at the seams, I was 23 years old, unemployed, and completely lost. I hadn't finished college, didn't have a career path, and spent most of my days lying in bed, doom, scrolling through the news and watching YouTube videos until my phone overheated. Everything felt pointless. The future, my ambitions, what little I had left of them, seemed to crumble alongside the rest of the world. It wasn't just the pandemic shutting everything down. It was the overwhelming feeling that my life had no direction. I was stuck. Then, one night after watching a bunch of urban exploration videos, I had an idea. If these guys could rack up millions of views by sneaking into abandoned buildings and whispering into their cameras about ghosts, why couldn't I? I wasn't an expert filmmaker, but I had my phone, a cheap tripod, and plenty of free time. If I played my cards right, maybe I could make something out of it. At the very least, it would keep me from spiraling into another existential crisis. I launched my channel in April. The first few videos were rough, shaky footage, poor lighting, and my voice awkwardly narrating as I explored places like an old shopping mall or a run-down factory near my town. But I quickly realized something. People wanted to be scared. They didn't just want to see an empty building. They wanted an experience. So I started embellishing. I wasn't faking the locations. They were real, decayed, and forgotten by time. But I did start exaggerating my reactions. I'd pause in the middle of filming and widen my eyes, whispering, "Did you hear that?" even when there was nothing but silence. I'd pan the camera toward a dark hallway and pretend I saw movement. In post-production, I'd sometimes add faint sounds, things no one could prove weren't really there. It worked. By the end of summer, my subscriber count had grown from a depressing 120 to nearly 9,000. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to start making some money. Not a full-time income, but enough to upgrade my equipment, pay for gas, and most importantly, justify doing more of these videos. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually good at something. Like I had a purpose. I threw myself into it. Instead of just exploring my hometown, I researched abandoned places in other cities, even other states. The deeper I dug, the more I realized just how many forgotten places there were. Hospitals, factories, hotels, schools. Some had histories so dark they barely needed any embellishment at all. I upgraded my gear too. My shaky phone recordings were replaced with a decent camera and a stabilizer. I got a better microphone. Some night vision equipment, nothing too expensive, but enough to make my videos look professional. My storytelling improved. I leaned harder into the suspense, crafting narratives that made even the most mundane locations feel haunted. And people ate it up. They wanted to believe the shadows in the corners were moving. They wanted to think I wasn't alone in those buildings. And the more they believed, the more they watched, the more they commented, the more they subscribed. It became an addiction. Every new video had to be scarier than the last. I started chasing thrills, pushing myself to explore riskier locations, places where no trespassing signs were more than just suggestions, places where I was genuinely afraid of getting caught, afraid of falling through rotting floors, afraid of what might actually be in the dark. But that fear, it was fuel, and I was ready to go even further. One night, while searching for new places to explore, I came across a YouTube channel that dwarfed mine in popularity. The guy had hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and one of his most watched videos had over 500,000 views. In it, He had spent a night in an abandoned fire lookout tower, completely isolated in the middle of nowhere. The idea fascinated me. I had never stayed overnight in any of the locations I visited. I always showed up, filmed, and got out before it got too dark. But this was next level. Spending the entire night alone in a forgotten place. That would be a game changer for my channel. I was sure that an overnight video would bring in massive views. The anticipation of spending hours in total darkness, the idea of documenting every sound, every eerie moment, people would eat it up. Determined, I started planning. I researched the location, scouring forums, Reddit threads, and Google Maps to pinpoint its exact spot. The more I learned, the more intrigued I became. The tower was deep in the woods, miles away from civilization, accessible only by a long uphill hike. That only made it better. The more isolated, the scarier it would be. I made a detailed checklist of everything I'd need for the trip. Food, water, flashlight, backup batteries, a thick sleeping bag, because I had read that temperatures could drop to around 20 degrees at night. I didn't want to freeze to death for the sake of content. I even bought a small portable heater just in case. I went over my filming equipment multiple times. I charged every battery, tested every camera, and packed extra memory cards. There would be no second chances. If my equipment died, so would the video. I needed to be prepared. The more I planned, the more obsessed I became. I imagined the intro, the camera angles, the moments I could play up for suspense. I thought about the thumbnail, the eerie silhouette of the abandoned tower against a star-filled sky. I could already see the title. I spent a night in an abandoned fire lookout tower, alone. This was going to be huge. Bigger than anything I had ever done. Maybe this would be the video that pushed my channel into the big leagues. Maybe this would be the moment I went from small-time YouTuber to full-time content creator. As I packed my bag, a thrill coursed through me. Pure, unfiltered excitement. I was ready. I had no idea what was waiting for me. The morning of the trip, I was up before my alarm. By 7 a.m., I was on the road, the excitement humming through me like caffeine. The drive to the fire lookout was supposed to take around 4 hours. 4 hours of winding highways, rural roads, and finally, a stretch of dirt path leading deep into the woods. I had my playlist queued up, a mix of classic rock and some atmospheric synth music to set the tone. The road was smooth, the weather was perfect, and for the first couple of hours, I felt nothing but anticipation. This was going to be my best video yet. I imagined the suspense, the eerie shots of the empty fire lookout tower against the night sky. The thought of all the views I'd rack up sent a rush of adrenaline through me. Then I glanced at my dashboard and my stomach dropped. My gas gauge was dangerously low. Shit. I hadn't even noticed how much fuel I had burned through. I must underestimated the distance when I last filled up, and now I was running close to empty with no idea where the nearest gas station was. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone, quickly pulling up Google Maps. I searched for gas stations along my route, and my stomach sank further. There was only one nearby, and it wasn't exactly on a major highway. The station was located inside a small, semi-abandoned town about 10 miles off the main road. I hesitated. I'd never heard of the town before, and judging by the reviews, what few there were, it wasn't exactly a thriving place. But I didn't have a choice. If I didn't refuel now, I wouldn't make it to the fire lookout, let alone back home. I turned onto the exit leading to the town. my tires kicking up dust as I followed the narrow road. As I got closer, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The place looked dead. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Towns, even small ones, have a kind of background noise. Cars, distant conversations, dogs barking. But here, nothing. Just the soft hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the brittle trees. Most of the buildings were crumbling, their paint peeling and windows boarded up. The streets were cracked and littered with debris. A few rusted cars sat abandoned on the side of the road, their tires deflated, their windshields clouded with dirt. Despite the overwhelming emptiness, there were signs that some people still lived here. A few houses looked semi-maintained, with old cars parked outside. Some windows had curtains drawn shut, but there were no lights on, no movement. It was like a town, frozen in time, barely clinging to existence. I slowed down, reaching for my camera. This place was perfect. I could already imagine how it would look in my video. Desolate, eerie, unsettling. I pulled over briefly and filmed a slow pan of the street, making sure to capture the abandoned homes and the rusting cars. I narrated in a hushed tone, the way I always did when I wanted to build suspense. This town, it's empty, no people, barely any signs of life. It's like something out of a horror movie. As I kept driving toward the gas station, the feeling of unease only grew. There was something deeply wrong with this place. Not just the abandonment, but the absence, the complete lack of any human presence. I pulled into the gas station, the only business in town that still seemed operational. It was an old, run-down station with a single pump, the kind of place that hadn't been renovated in decades. The overhead sign was faded and cracked, barely legible. The windows of the attached convenience store were grimy, streaked with dirt, and something that looked suspiciously like dried handprints. I stepped out of my car, glancing around. The air was cold, despite the sun climbing higher in the sky. I grabbed the pump, swiped my card, and started filling my tank. That's when I saw him. An old man, probably in his 60s, stood near the entrance of the store. He was watching me, not in a casual way, not in the way small-town folks might observe an unfamiliar visitor. No, this was different. His gaze was sharp, assessing. His face was worn, lined with deep wrinkles, his skin leathery from years in the sun. His clothes were simple. A faded flannel shirt, jeans, and old boots. Something about him felt off. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the gas pump. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt his eyes on me. Finally, he started walking toward me, slow and deliberate. I tensed. He stopped a few feet away, still studying me. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, he said, "You're not from around here, are you?" His tone wasn't exactly threatening, but it wasn't friendly either. It was knowing. Like he had already figured out everything about me the moment I pulled into town. I forced a polite smile. "No, just passing through." He squinted. "Where you headed?" I hesitated. Something in my gut told me not to answer. But I also didn't want to seem rude. "Ah, I'm visiting the fire lookout tower nearby." The old man's expression didn't change immediately. Then, slowly, he scoffed. It wasn't amusement, it was something else. A mix of disbelief and, was that pity? "Hey, really?" he muttered. "Well, good luck with that." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the store without another word. I stood there for a moment, my pulse hammering in my ears. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I didn't stick around to find out. As soon as my tank was full, I got back into my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the station. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look in my rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if he was still watching me. As I drove out of town, the sense of unease lingered. The old man's reaction gnawed at me. It wasn't just what he had said. It was the way he said it. Like he knew something I didn't. Like he had seen this before. Like he didn't expect me to come back. I shook off the thought, forcing myself to focus. I was probably just letting my imagination get the best of me. It was an old, dying town, and I was an outsider. Of course, the locals would be wary of strangers. Still, as I merged back onto the main road, leaving that ghost town behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a mistake. And I hadn't even reached the fire lookout yet. I left the car behind, its tires crunching over gravel as I pulled into a small clearing at the edge of the forest. According to my research, the final stretch to the fire lookout tower was just 12 miles on a smooth road. Instead, I was faced with a rough, uneven path that looked like it hadn't seen a proper maintenance crew in decades. My heart sank as I realized that this road was completely unsuitable for my car. If I had a 4x4, maybe I could have forced my way through. But that wasn't an option now. Don't be a coward, I muttered to myself, trying to muster some courage. Just park the car somewhere safe between the trees and keep going on foot. Don't be a coward. I took a deep breath, grabbed my backpack, and left the vehicle, locking it securely and stepping into the wild unknown. The first steps on the rugged path were filled with an uneasy crunch underfoot. I adjusted the straps on my backpack, making sure my camera and extra batteries were secure, and started down the trail. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, but as I progressed further, the trees grew thicker, and the sunlight faded to an eerie twilight, even though it was still day. Strangely, there was an oppressive silence that blanketed the forest. I was used to the familiar symphony of nature. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, even the distant sound of a breeze weaving through the branches. But today, nothing stirred. There was no sound at all. The silence was so complete, it felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. With every step, the quiet grew more disconcerting, and I felt a creeping sense of isolation that I hadn't experienced in any of my previous explorations. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't like any abandoned place I had ever been to before. All my previous videos had been staged with a touch of fake terror, an eerie sound effect here, a staged gasp there. But this was different. The desolation of the forest seemed genuine, raw, and unfiltered. The ghostly quiet was not an effect to be enhanced in post-production. It was real, and it was unnerving. As I trekked further along the path, the forest around me began to feel like a living, breathing entity. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Every tree a silent witness to my intrusion. I couldn't help but think of all the fabricated scares I had created for my viewers. The jump scares, the whispered, "Did you hear that?" moments. All of it had been nothing compared to the palpable fear I was now experiencing. I recalled the time I'd encountered a homeless man in an abandoned school building. The man who had simply sat there, unthreatening, yet whose presence had once startled me. But now, in this eerie stillness, even that memory seemed trivial. With each mile, the weight of solitude bore down on me. I felt as though I were trespassing, not just on abandoned land, but on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The path itself was a trial. Jagged rocks, overgrown roots, and sudden dips in the terrain made every step a potential hazard. My mind kept replaying the old man's dismissive words at the gas station, and now, in this isolated stretch of wilderness, they resonated with a dark irony. I wondered if the old man had known something about this place that I didn't. Perhaps he had seen these roads before, had walked this path in better days. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I forced myself to push on, determined to reach the fire lookout tower. Every slow, cautious step was a battle against the primal urge to turn back. I kept reminding myself that I was not a coward, that I had taken on challenges before, but as I continued through the oppressive silence and the rugged terrain, I couldn't help but feel that this journey was testing more than just my physical endurance. It was a confrontation with the raw, unedited fear that no amount of fake scares could ever truly replicate. In that moment, I realized that my previous explorations had only been a rehearsal, a carefully curated performance for the camera. After what felt like an eternity of trudging through the rugged path, I finally arrived at the base of the fire lookout tower. A wave of relief mixed with trepidation washed over me as I took in the sight of its towering silhouette, a decaying giant looming against a sullen sky. I paused for a moment, letting the enormity of the structure sink in, before pulling out my camera to capture its forlorn presence from below. The tower was everything I had imagined and more. An imposing relic, its once proud frame now marred by decay and neglect. The wood, darkened by years of exposure, was splintered and warped, and even the staircase at the base was in a state of disrepair. Each step appeared as though it might give way at any moment, a silent testament to the passage of time and the relentless force of nature. I steadied my hands and began filming, narrating in my usual hushed tone to build the suspense that my viewers loved. Here it is. I whispered into the camera, the fire, lookout tower, a forgotten sentinel standing guard over a desolate land. I moved slowly around the structure, capturing every detail. The chipped paint, the moss, clinging desperately to the decaying wood, and the way the tower's height seemed almost surreal from this angle. Just as I prepared to begin my ascent, a sudden sound shattered the quiet. A branch snapped sharply among the trees, echoing through the stillness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the dense forest, my eyes searching for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. The sound had been so abrupt, so out of place, that it sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, the instinct to flee, battling with my resolve to press on. Determined not to let fear derail my project, I clutched my GoPro tightly and approached the staircase. Each step was a gamble, the wood groaning under my weight as I climbed. The staircase was rickety and uneven, its decay a constant reminder of the tower's fragility. With every cautious step, I felt as though I were ascending not only a physical structure, but also the threshold into a deeper realm of uncertainty. After what seemed like an endless climb, I finally reached the top. I paused at the summit, panting from exhaustion, my muscles screaming in protest. The view was breathtaking yet eerie. From this height, the landscape stretched out in a desolate panorama, and the tower's interior was a haunting mess of broken windows and crumbling floors. My eyes caught sight of irregular brown stains on the floor, too dark and smeared to be anything ordinary. I couldn't tell if they were remnants of old blood or something else entirely, a mystery left to the imagination. I set my camera to record as I began to slowly survey the area, my voice a mix of awe and apprehension. Each broken pane and every shadowy corner added to the uncanny ambience of the tower. Then, amid my careful narration, A subtle sound broke the heavy silence, a faint scurrying noise from one of the corners. I whipped around, heart leaping into my throat, only to see a small mouse darting away into the recesses of the tower. For a moment, relief mingled with lingering dread. The sound had been nothing more than a tiny creature seeking shelter. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my racing heart, and continued filming, determined to capture every haunting detail of this forsaken place. Darkness descended quickly over the dilapidated tower, and I knew that my real test was only just beginning. With a trembling hand, I set up 3 cameras in the cramped space of the tower's upper room. 2 were positioned in the corners opposite my makeshift sleeping area, and the third was aimed out of the only window, capturing the bleak, sprawling forest beyond. I meticulously checked each angle, ensuring that every possible shadow was recorded, a silent witness to the night. Before settling in, I decided to prepare some food and document the history of the place for my viewers. I pulled out my portable stove and a small packet of dehydrated soup, setting up a mini cooking station near a rickety table. As I stirred the water and watched the steam curl upward, I talked into the camera about the tower's past. Once a proud sentinel of the forest, now left to rot under nature's relentless siege. My voice echoed softly in the vast emptiness, blending with the creaks and groans of the decaying structure. No sooner had I finished my narration than an icy grip clamped around my neck. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The sensation was shockingly real, a sudden, invasive cold that defied explanation. I jerked my head around, eyes straining in the dim light, but saw nothing but the oppressive darkness of the tower. My breath hitched as panic began to seep in, a creeping dread that whispered of unseen forces. I scrambled to the corner where my cameras were set up, hoping that one of them might have caught something. With shaking fingers, I checked each device, only to find that none of them were recording. I distinctly remembered pressing the record button on each one, yet the screens now lay blank, mocking me with their emptiness. The realization sent a chill deeper than the one that had gripped me moments before. It wasn't just that I was alone in this forsaken place. It was that something was actively preventing me from documenting its presence. The isolation was now absolute. Far from the safety of my car and surrounded by the weight of pitch black, a raw sense of vulnerability overtook me. I hurriedly reconfigured the cameras, double-checking every setting, and pressed the record button with deliberate care, determined to capture any sign of what lurked in the darkness. I needed to prove to myself, and to my future viewers, deciding that the best way to maintain my composure, and to possibly trap any future intruder, I opted to pretend to sleep on camera. I unrolled my battered sleeping bag in a corner of the room, its faded fabric barely clinging to the frame of the old structure, and settled in. I deliberately closed my eyes, trying to feign the calm of slumber, even as my mind raced with every unexplained sound. Strangely, within less than half an hour, exhaustion overcame me. Despite my inner turmoil and the persistent feeling of dread, I drifted into an uneasy sleep, my body succumbing to fatigue, while my mind remained alert on the edge of terror. In the depths of that fragile slumber, I was abruptly yanked back into consciousness by a guttural shout. "Wake up." The voice was so forceful that it felt like a physical blow, as if the shout had ripped my soul from its moorings. My heart thundered as I bolted upright, eyes darting around the darkened room. I searched desperately for the source of the sound, scanning every corner, peering into the shadowed recesses behind broken furniture, but found nothing, only an unsettling emptiness. Yet, amid that frantic search, I couldn't shake the peculiar smell that now filled the space, a scent that was not my own, but rather something musty and distinctly human. It was as if another presence had been there with me, lingering unseen and unbidden. The combination of the cold grip on my neck, the camera's mysterious failure, and that foreign odor ignited a potent mix of fear and curiosity. I huddled in my sleeping bag, the memory of that chilling shout echoing in my ears, my mind racing to connect the disjointed fragments of my experience. Whatever had been here with me was more than just a figment of my imagination, and as I lay there in the suffocating darkness, I realized that this night was far from over, and the true terror was only beginning to reveal itself. Only a few minutes after I settled into my restless vigil, the silence was shattered by an intense, rhythmic knocking coming from outside the tower. At first, it was subtle, a gentle tap that I assumed was the wind. But then, it grew louder and more insistent. I pressed my ear to the cold, cracked window, straining to catch any sound that might hint at its source. Yet, when I looked out, there was nothing. No movement. Just the endless dark of the forest. The knocking persisted, fading in and out, as if whatever was there was playing a cruel game of hide and seek with my already fragile nerves. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was merely an echo of the creaks and groans of this decaying structure. But deep down, I knew something was off. The rhythm of the knocks was almost deliberate, like a coded message meant to unsettle. As the minutes dragged by, the sound would disappear for a heartbeat, only to return with renewed intensity. It was as if the very walls of the tower were conspiring to drive me to the brink of madness. Every passing moment felt like an eternity. I could hear my own breathing, loud in the oppressive silence that had now turned hostile. The knocking began to blend with my racing thoughts, creating an overwhelming symphony of dread that crescendoed in my mind. I found myself clenching my fists, trying to anchor myself in the reality of the situation. Yet the fear was relentless. The minutes stretched into hours. Each second was a trial by terror that left me questioning my decision to spend the night in such a forsaken place. At some point, when the clock finally crept to 4, the relentless knocking ceased as abruptly as it had started. The sudden absence of the sound was deafening in its own right, as if the silence was now mocking me with its finality. I sat there, paralyzed by a sense of disbelief and horror, feeling as if I had been driven to the edge of sanity. Every nerve in my body screamed for an explanation, but none came. I could hardly move. I forced myself to gather my belongings, the backpack, my notes, and every piece of equipment that had witnessed my descent into this living nightmare. With trembling hands, I packed up the cameras and the few personal items that I had dared bring with me. There was no time to linger. The first pale hints of dawn were beginning to bleed through the cracks of the dilapidated walls, and I knew that escape was my only option. I made my way down the creaking staircase with the cold efficiency of someone who has seen too much. When I finally reached the ground level, the chill of early morning was a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of my fear. My way back to my car was many times faster than when I left it. I hurried to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. Once inside, I didn't bother with the lock or the mirrors. I just drove off as fast as I could, my eyes fixed on the horizon where the first light of day promised safety. The drive back was a blur of winding roads and my own frenzied thoughts. I couldn't escape the questions that throbbed in my mind. What had caused that knocking? Was it some malevolent spirit or something else entirely? The unanswered questions gnawed at me relentlessly, leaving me with a sense of profound disorientation. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I was still trying to piece together the fragments of that night. unable to shake the feeling that the true horror was not yet over. In the days following the incident, I avoided one thing above all else: the cameras and the footage. I couldn't bear to relive the terror that had been captured by my own devices. I left the files untouched on my hard drive, a silent repository of the nightmare I had narrowly escaped. The thought of watching that footage, of facing the shadow and the unnatural events that had unfolded, was too much to bear. I wanted to erase every memory of that night from my mind, to pretend that it had been nothing more than a bad dream. But as the days turned into weeks, curiosity began to gnaw at me. I was a creator, after all, driven by the need to understand and document the unknown. With a heavy heart and trembling fingers, I finally mustered the courage to review the footage. What I found sent a shudder racing down my spine. In the footage of me sleeping, captured in the dim glow of the tower's interior, a dark, indistinct shape appeared in the corner of the frame. The shadow lingered there, silent and unnervingly still, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. Then, almost as if on cue, the recording captured the moment when a loud, terrifying shout pierced the darkness. "Wake up!" My heart nearly stopped as I watched myself bolt awake in sheer terror, my panicked voice filling the audio track. But as quickly as the shadow had been seen, it vanished from the frame, leaving nothing behind but the echo of my own screams. That was the final nail in the coffin for me. The incident left me in a state of dreadful shock, one from which I could not recover. I abandoned my YouTube channel immediately, unable to face the idea of sharing that horror with the world. Several months later, I deleted the channel entirely. I couldn't bear to have even a digital trace of that experience lingering in my life. I spent countless sleepless nights trying to rationalize what had happened, to piece together some semblance of logic from the chaos of my memories. I never did understand what had happened that night. The knocking, the inexplicable failure of my cameras, the shadow that watched me as I slept, all of it defied explanation. I scoured forums and old articles, desperate for any clue, any historical record of similar occurrences in that remote area. But nothing concrete ever emerged. Now, as I write this, I do so as a cautionary tale, a reminder to anyone tempted by the thrill of urban exploration. Don't be lured by the allure of abandoned places. No amount of curiosity or bravado can prepare you for the depths of terror that await when you spend a night alone in a place where the past refuses to rest.